Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. And this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, politics and sport, and anything else we can think of. Now, today's guest is a lawyer and an author. Her name is Sarah Phillmore, and she's here to talk to me today. Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
Right. So I've just mentioned this brief description of you there, that you're a lawyer and an author. Can you just describe a little bit more about yourself, such as how you got into law? What are you currently doing now?
Yeah, I'm currently a barrister who specialises in public law Children Act proceedings, which means care proceedings. So that's children being removed from their parents by a local authority. So I represent local authorities, parents and guardians. So I see all angles of those cases. And I set up a website in 2014 called the Child Protection Resource Online, just trying to provide understandable information for parents, because I know the system can be very confusing and overwhelming for them.
Okay. So obviously you've been in law a long time. And I remember a few years ago speaking to some barristers and lawyers who weren't technically on strike because legally they can't go on strike, but they were unhappy with a lot of the conditions that are happening in the legal system regarding their pay and other things. And I was just wanted to know, how else has the justice system in this country changed over the last decade or so?
Well, the big change for me was LASPO. I think that's the Legal Aid, Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act. That removed legal aid from a large amount of civil proceedings. Because I don't know really what's going on in detail with the criminal bar, other than I know it's pretty bad in terms of the pay that they get for the work that they do. So that's why they went on strike. I haven't been affected that badly because parents still get non-means, non-merits tested legal aid for care proceedings, which I think is quite right. If the state's going to take your children away, you shouldn't have to pay for a lawyer as well. But I think we're really seeing how difficult it is for people to navigate the system without legal help. And if there's no legal aid, then it's too expensive, frankly, for the vast majority of people to instruct a lawyer.
Yeah, well, I see it quite a lot on social media and other cases where people now are having to raise their own funds via some payments, such as not Patreon, but that like a crowdfunding system. Is that another change that's happened like more and more over the last decade? People have had to do that just to get the money in order to fight their cause.
Well, crowdfunding's been a bit of a game changer for those sort of bigger cases. And I look at what the Good Law Project has done, for example. I think for individual parents, I haven't seen much evidence of that. But I mean, it's open to them to try it. You're looking at, say, a contested private law case start, between £10,000 and £50,000, if not more. Some of the worst cases, 6 figures. So I'm not sure how sustainable that is in the long run as a way of achieving access to justice. We either need to make the law a lot more simple, or we need to restore legal aid for parents.
And I imagine because of that, you've had certain cases which, even if the police have the evidence, they can't necessarily go to court because the person prosecuting the prosecutors basically can't afford to actually go to court. And I imagine crime rates as a result have actually been very affected as
well. That's not the case in criminal matters, because it's not the victim who prosecutes, it's the state.
Yeah.
So the problems, though there are huge problems in the criminal justice system, I mean, the wheels are coming off it. COVID didn't help, but there's a huge backlog in hearing cases. So a lot of cases are just stuck in limbo. I think a lot of cases don't proceed to trial, probably for that basis. So there are huge problems, but it's not to do with a person not being able to afford to prosecute. It's very, very rare to have a private prosecution. It's possible, but the state will usually take it over. I think Stephen Lawrence's parents tried a private prosecution. That's the only recent example I can think of. Again, it's just completely beyond the financial capacity of the vast majority of people to do something like that.
Now, I was at the Battle of Ideas last year, and I'm going again this year, and I saw a debate of you. Oh, sorry, someone else will get that. I saw a debate with you regarding lawfare.
Yeah.
So can you please describe what lawfare is to those who don't know?
Well, lawfare is as it says on the tin, it's using law as a weapon in a war. And this is where crowdfunding has come in, because certainly where I've been quite interested in this is about issues regarding gender identity ideology, because I think there's been a lot of unfairness and unlawful decisions, because a lot of organisations and individuals have taken the view that if you don't support gender identity ideology, you're a horrible person. Now, that isn't the case. But in order to prove that isn't the case, we've had to go to court. Maya Forstater had to go to the Employment Appeal Tribunal. She crowdfunded for that. I mean, that cost a staggering amount of money. Alison Bailey, the Black lesbian barrister, had to raise just up £500,000 to take her own chambers and Stonewall to an employment tribunal because she'd been treated badly for having what are called gender critical views. So neither of those women should have had to have done that. But without crowdfunding, they probably wouldn't have been able to. And we got some really interesting legal results from those cases. So I think they were worth every penny. But the sad thing is we had to use them to just try and reestablish what should have been our basic rights. Alison Bailey ought to have been allowed to tweet about joining the LGB Alliance without being treated in the way she was by her chambers. Why on earth should she have to have raised £500,000 to fight that? But I'm glad she did. So this is sort of the situation we're at the moment. Lawfare is being used not to create new law, but to try and protect existing law. And it's kind of frustrating that we're having to do that, because I think the last time I looked at the figures, over £3 million have been raised by individuals to go to court about issues regarding gender identity ideology. Now that's £3 million that should not have had to have been spent. It is crazy.
Yeah, it is indeed. I went to a Free Speech Union event recently, and I think a lot of their cases are basically based on that particular topic as well. So it is something that's just clogging up the courts like no end. And just expanding on lawfare, I mean, you've got the situation with Harry Miller.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, who retweeted a tweet that was seen as transphobic. He didn't even correct the tweet. But the reason I bring that up is because that's the first time I heard of his non-crime hate incidents. Now, I couldn't believe it when I heard it. I know this is a cliche, but it really was Orwellian. However, and thankfully for him, I think correct me if I'm wrong, by being removed from his record. However, I'm just wondering, it doesn't seem to be in the public eye as much. And is there a danger with some of this that unless you keep on bringing it in the public eye, that in other cases, the decisions could be reversed?
Oh, well, I think it still is in the public eye. I mean, Harry's scored a great victory. It's taken time. But remember, he had the Court of Appeal judgment, I think, the end of 2021. Then Parliament stepped in and said, we've got to have a parliamentary code of practice about these non-crime hate incidents. We didn't get that, a draft one, until about March of this year. So everything just takes a long time. But now we've got revised guidance from the College of Policing, which I think is great because Harry's achieved what he wanted to achieve. Perception-based recording is gone, because that's what got Harry into trouble. Before, all you had to do was ring up the police and say, I feel upset, I feel offended, I feel this is wrong. And the police had to record it against your name as a non-crime hate incident. They had no choice, because when I got my information from the police, they recorded me as a barrister posting hate with my full name, my address, my telephone number, and my email. And one of the examples of this hatred was a picture of my dog. And I tweeted, my dog would call me a Nazi for cheese. So all someone had done was search my tweets for the word Nazi, trans, and reported them all to the police, who had to record them. So the new guidance says you've got to exercise common sense. You've got to weed out malicious and irrational people who are just using this as a weapon against someone. And also you've got to restrict the amount of data you record about them. There's absolutely no need for all that sensitive personal data about me to be recorded. Because the idea about non-crime hate incidents, I absolutely get why. Because when Stephen Lawrence was murdered, the police refused to investigate because they were racist. And so Lord Macpherson, in his inquiry, said, all right, the police are systemically racist. This is what we're going to do. We're not going to give them a choice. If somebody reports there's an incident of racism or other hatred, the police have no choice but to investigate it and take it seriously. But what happened in the years after Stephen Lawrence's murder, that just turned into a glorified form of box ticking. So people would report, it was recorded, and nothing was done with it. The College of Policing Barristers said to the Court of Appeal, there were so many non-crime hate incidents, I think the estimates are about 200,000, that no force could analyse them. So it was pointless. Because see, the whole point was to build up a picture. Is there a particular potential hotspot of racism or homophobia in a particular area? Do we, the police, need to be keeping an eye out and perhaps putting some extra resources in? Now, that's all completely sensible and good operational police work. But there's absolutely no point in just having a groaning database of crazy, malicious complaints about people, which don't even go anywhere. I mean, if Wiltshire are trying to say that I'm an example of a one-woman crime wave and transphobia is now a big problem in Wiltshire because of me, well, then they need to do something about me, don't they? Because I had 3 separate non-crime hate incident recordings about me. So I had escalated, but nobody ever did anything. No one's come to arrest me. So what is the point of the police keeping all this information on citizens? Because of course, remember, the big thing was nobody could be clear with us who would see these recordings. But it did seem that if you applied for a job requiring enhanced disclosure and barring service checks, you're working with children or vulnerable adults, there was a real risk that that information would be shown. So if I'd say, I don't know, applied to work with vulnerable children, someone would have been sent that bit of paper saying a barrister posting hate. I don't think I would have got the job. So happily, all my hate incidents have been deleted. All of Harry's have. And on the 20th of May, we invited everybody to contact their own police force to see what they got recorded about them. And the reason for the 20th of May was it was John Stuart Mill's birthday that day. And he was the philosopher quoted in Harry Miller's case, who wrote a lot in the 19th century about the importance of freedom of speech. I mean, we shouldn't have to keep reinventing this wheel. For hundreds of years, we've known how important this is. But it's really scary, isn't it? Because it shows how quickly you can lose it. Just 10 years, we've come so close to losing these fundamental rights.
Yeah, I think we should have something like we have in America, where they have the I can't remember which amendment it is, the first or second, but obviously the right to free speech.
Yeah.
Because we'll stop a lot of these as well. I mean,
well, we did have Article 10 of the European Convention, which is sort of our equivalent. Free speech is protected in this country. We've just had, over the past couple of years, lots of unlawful decisions, which we've had to fight with lawfare. So yeah, we're not left unprotected. But the problem is, if people just ignore or disobey the law, then the victim has to fight back and apply to court, and that costs money, takes time, and it's really stressful.
Yeah, I can imagine. And also, with regards to this non-crime hate incident, I understand what you're saying in terms of the context with the Stephen Lawrence case, but isn't a problem with that is it's not, law shouldn't be about feelings. It should be about, in many respects, should be about, right, this is the law, and this is what happens if you break it. And
I think the Macpherson report was definitely based on really noble and good intentions. And he did say the police had to investigate. Yeah. So he wasn't saying, this is about someone feeling that someone else is racist. Yeah. It's about the police not being allowed to ignore anyone and getting on and investigating it. And he felt that was really necessary because the police had shown themselves to be systemically racist. I mean, I do think surely the better and more long-term solution would be to say, well, how do we stop the police being systemically racist? Not say they've got to investigate absolutely everything that's reported to them, because we see where we ended up then in 2019 with people like Harry being abused by the system. Because remember, the judge in Harry's case said the trans woman who'd reported him was on the outer edges of rationality. I mean, she started saying that he was an anti-Semite, he would have been responsible for murdering Jews in the Holocaust. And the judge was just going, he tweeted a few things, calm down. But the police had to take that person seriously. And well, in a way, thank God they did, because without Harry, I would never even have thought to contact the police to see if they had recordings about me, because I am a noble, law-abiding citizen. The police won't have anything on me. Yeah. So thank God for Harry, because he opened a lot of our eyes, I think, about really what was going on and how frightening it was.
It seems like a very spiteful law as well. Like someone who's really vindictive could actually use it against you, and that wouldn't just
Oh, that's exactly how it was being used against all of us who were gender critical, all of us who were saying, look, hang on a minute. We of course, we don't support anyone being abused or threatened, but you can't change sex. And it's really important for women that we know that, because women are particularly vulnerable to male violence and we need single sex female spaces. All of us who were saying that, which I think is completely reasonable, were being reported as hateful bigots, and women lost their jobs. Maya Forstater is the obvious example. Alison Bailey also was treated unfairly at work. I mean, it is just bonkers. I can't think of a more reasonable word for it.
Yeah. Speaking of what you just said, I know this week in Parliament, at the time we're recording this, there was a debate about the Equality Act and whether how to define sex, whether it should be biological or gender, basically how it should be defined in the law. I know I had a discussion on it. I know things were tweeted, but has anything gone further with that, or the government set a date to when they're going to make a decision?
No, what happened was in 2018, which is how a lot of us got involved in this debate, because I hadn't a clue what was going on about gender before. I was just getting on living my life. But in 2018, the government proposed reform to the Gender Recognition Act to make it easier to get a gender recognition certificate. Because at the moment, you've got to have, I think, a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. You've got to live as the opposite sex for a long period of time. And the proposals were basically any man who said he was a woman should get a certificate saying, I am now a woman. Now, the consequences of that are really, really frightening, because there's lots of cases coming through now. And I was just this morning looking at the tweets from the ACLU in America, really horrible bloke called Dwayne, who raped and murdered a child and another woman, and it was on death row for 30 years and was finally executed in Florida recently. And the ACLU weren't upset about that. I mean, I think keeping someone on death row for 30 years is obscene. Kill them or don't, but what the hell is going on? But the ACLU were really upset because Dwayne was really a woman, and Dwayne hadn't been honoured in her womanhood when in prison. So presumably the ACLU was saying, well, Dwayne should just have been put in a female prison then, because Dwayne's a woman. And there's a picture of this man, and he just looked like every stereotypical child rapist you can think of, and very clearly male. So this is what all us women were jumping up and down saying, reform to the Gender Recognition Act is going to allow men like that to simply say, I'm a woman, gov, and then be allowed to go wherever women go. And in a prison, that's particularly bad for the women there, because there's no escape route. So all this debate has been rumbling on. It got so ferocious, the government said, all right, we're not going to amend the Gender Recognition Act. But of course, the problems haven't gone away, because the men who want to be women are still fighting. The women who want their single sex spaces are fighting back. So Sex Matters, which is Maya Forstater's organisation, started a petition saying, could we just please all be clear that when we're talking about sex, we mean biology. Gender's something different. Gender is how you feel about your sex, how you dress, how you do your hair, how you like people to call you. But it's not sex, because you can't change that. As soon as the sperm hits the egg and you are conceived, you are the sex you are. And for 99.9% of us, that's immediately obvious. Like, you can tell I'm a woman, I can tell you're a man, I don't have to check your genitals. It's pretty bloody obvious. So there was then a counter petition of people who wanted to say, no, let's make sex easily obtainable by way of a gender recognition certificate. So the government had their debate, because that's what the laws around petitions say. I think once you get to 100,000 signatures, the government has to have a debate. But I don't think there are any plans in the pipeline to try and change the law, because it was such, I think, a really bruising experience for the government, because they expected just to get the reforms in without anybody noticing. But we'd all started to wake up then, because we'd all started to think, hang on a minute, it's just not right that men should be able to say, I'm a woman, and compete in women's sports, and, therefore destroy women's sports. Because, I'll never forget that someone told me the statistic when I was about 20, that almost every man I met would be much physically stronger than I was. I might be able to win a fight with a 70-year-old. But, and that's just a basic biological reality. Even men who are shorter and don't weigh as much as me would beat me in a fight, because they're men and they're stronger. So I think a lot of women woke up around 2018 because of that debate. I don't know what's going to happen now. Sadly, I don't think we've got the caliber of politicians we need for this to be done sensibly. And because it's so toxic and horrible on social media and everyone's talking about being genocided and committing suicide, it's got too toxic, I think, for many to touch, which is a real shame because it's an issue of great importance, not just for women, but for children. Because, of course, that's the other issue that's really big and frightening, isn't it? These young children aged 11 being put on puberty blockers, then cross-sex hormones, and losing their fertility and their sexual function as an adult. I mean, this is just wicked. We can't do this to children, and they certainly can't consent to it. I mean, at the age of 11, did you have any idea how your life was going to pan out? Did you have any idea if you'd want to have kids? Or I think most 11-year-olds don't have a clue. So that those are the two issues that really drive me. I'm really worried for the safety of women and for children. And I do think we need the politicians to step up and actually get some sensible laws, because it's so confusing at the moment. Nobody knows what the hell is going on.
We're talking about it in terms of the Equality Act, but how would that have an effect on other laws? Because I imagine other laws which are specific to women as well. If, say, something like what you're saying went through, that would have, do you understand what I mean? That would have a negative effect on.
Oh, the Equality Act has a huge impact on, I mean, it applies to all public bodies. They can't discriminate against a protected characteristic. It applies to all service providers. So if you want to get a room in a hotel, they can't say, no, go away, you're gay or you're black, I'm not having you. They can't do that. And obviously it applies to all employers. They can't discriminate against people they employ who've got protected characteristic. So it's so important. It's all those areas of life where you need to be sure what people mean when they say sex and what they mean when they say gender. And what we've all noticed the past couple of years, people have been very sneaky. And, you know, when you fill in the equality, diversity, inclusion stuff, when you're asked to, it now doesn't ask you what sex you are, it asks you what gender you are. And there's very often not a box for me to say, I don't have a gender, I have a sex and I have a personality. I don't consider myself as having a gender. I don't know what it means. No one can really explain it to me other than it seems to be based on stereotypes. So if I wore a pink frilly dress and lipstick, I would have a feminine gender. But it makes no sense to me. I'm female. I've got lots of personality traits that people say are quite masculine because I can be quite aggressive in argument and so on. But I'm not a man. I know that. So yeah, we desperately need clarity. I mean, that £3 million raised in crowdfunding, it must be double that by now. I haven't checked the figures for about 6 months. But like you say, with the Free Speech Union, there are loads more cases coming through. Yeah, I reckon that figure must have doubled by now. That's crazy, isn't it? It's not just the money, it's the time, all our energy. And I think I've been putting so much energy into this for about 5 years. It shouldn't ever have needed to be done.
Well, we've talked about it in terms of the courts and the government changing law. I imagine the police, and not just with this topic, but with other topics like this, there's this issue with the police in terms of just numbers. And I'm just wondering, would they have the time to investigate some of these? Not just this, but like hate crime.
Well, you say that, but I'm really worried that the police are taking the path of least resistance. Remember Harry and Darren Brady got arrested last year over that posting of the Progress Pride flag tilted at an angle, so it looked like a swastika.
Yeah.
And Darren Brady was threatened with arrest, and Harry Miller went down saying, no, this isn't right. And Harry got arrested for obstruction. Now, the Chief Constable of Hampshire Police recently wrote to Harry saying, we're not taking any further action against you or Mr. Brady, but if you publish that picture again, it is a criminal offence under the Communications Act. So Harry, being Harry, published it again on Twitter and got about 1 million views and was saying to the Chief Constable, well, arrest me then. And you see, what a lot of effort had been put into arresting Darren Brady. So I do worry. I mean, the police are only human. They don't want to get stabbed or seriously hurt, and they often do. And I don't want this to be about bashing the police, because they keep us safe. You know, when they do their jobs properly, they're the ones running towards danger to keep us safe. And I'm very, very grateful and thankful for that. But I suppose I can see that you don't want to get stabbed by some teenager on drugs. It's a lot easier to go round, you know, to a middle-aged woman and accuse her of putting up naughty stickers. That's what happened to Jenny Swain. And Faircop helped her raise money to get a solicitor to deal with that. But she was arrested, taken to the station. The police conducted, I think, an illegal search of her house and seized her books. Now, this is a woman on a mobility scooter. She does not present a risk to anybody. So God knows how much police time and money was wasted on that. And you're quite right, they do not have the time, the money, or the officers to be fanning about like this. And when we look at what's going on in terms of our cities, especially knife crime amongst the young, I wonder whether there's quite a deliberate decision to turn away from that kind of dangerous crime. Oh, just let them all stab each other. We'll focus on the middle-aged people with some fruity tweets. And I think the Home Secretary is absolutely right. I mean, she keeps telling them, doesn't she? Will you stop this? Will you stop investigating social media use and actually deal with what I think most of us would call real crime?
Yeah, absolutely. And so far, we've mentioned some stories I've used lawfare. And one of the things I remember from your talk last year about ideas is when you said, even if you don't necessarily win a case, one of the good things about lawfare is it actually brings into the public eye issues and situations that otherwise would have been done.
Totally.
I think the example you used was the one in the woman in Bristol University who said she was attacked and then they hired an attacker. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, that was awful. That was Raquel Rosario Sanchez, who got subjected to really nasty treatment at Bristol University, and the main offender was then given a job in the law department. And she lost her case because I think Bristol had tried to settle with her. But that was quite interesting for revealing what was going on. And I think everyone was really shocked. The person who'd been harassing her is not fit to be employed by any university. I was really shocked about that. So I don't know, if that raising that awareness would actually do any good. But in terms of, say, my action against Eventbrite, I don't think for a moment I'm going to win against them because I'm not going to be able to raise enough money. But I'm hoping to have some more conversations about this as we go, raise it with my MP. Like you say, just raise awareness, get people talking, because most people were just not aware that anything odd was happening back in 2018. And a lot of people even now claim that they don't really understand what's going on. I think now it's too late to be that ignorant. And you really ought to have woken up by now to the fact something very unpleasant is happening.
Yeah, I was going to comment to that with your issue with Eventbrite. For those who don't know what happened, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you'd written a book, done a book launch for it, and decided to sell tickets to Eventbrite. And then Eventbrite basically said, no, we won't allow you to do this. After you sell so many tickets as well. So
well, thanks to people complaining about me, we sold out. And Eventbrite couldn't cancel the event, but they said you're not allowed to sell tickets on our platform because you were hateful. I mean, and the place we had the event was also getting pressure to pull it. So it could have turned out that we weren't allowed to meet at all. I mean, as it was, we met and it was fine. But, I'm not having the women who attended, the men who attended that event being called hateful, because they're not. I'm not hateful. I'd collected together with my collaborator, Al Peters, we just collected people's stories about basically when they woke up. When did they notice that something untoward was happening? And the stories, there's lots of variety of stories. Some people are very sad. Some people were quite funny. Some people had lost children or partners. But there's not a single person whose story we collected that is hateful. So I think Eventbrite are just an example of many of the US companies who treat people like this. And my point is, you can't operate and make a profit in the UK of UK citizens if you will not obey UK law. So I wanted to sue them under the Equality Act. But the problem is it looks as though they're going to insist I have to go to California, which obviously is not going to happen. So I'm going to have another go. We've got another book launch coming up in Manchester on the 22nd of July. So tonight I'm going to launch another Eventbrite ticket sales and see what happens. So, that just the fact of me doing that and then pulling it. I mean, I got a lot of publicity the last time round. I got a lot of people interested. So hopefully I might get some interest again and we can just talk about it. People need to know what's going on because at the moment we risk sliding into losing some really fundamental rights. I'm not sure how easy it is to get them back once they're gone. So I'd rather they didn't go.
Yeah. With lawfare, Is there a danger that you can sometimes make people more litigious?
Oh yeah, there's really downsides to it. And I think the biggest downside has been lawyers are creaming money out of this.
Yeah.
And it just shows how expensive litigation is and how far beyond the pocket of most people it is. I still don't understand why Alison Bailey needed £500,000. Something's gone very, very wrong with the system if it's that expensive
Yeah.
to defend. I mean, what was, to be honest, not a hugely complicated employment tribunal. It involved two separate organisations, a relatively discrete time frame. I really do struggle to see what's going on. And I know people who don't like lawfare say, well, it's just another way for lawyers to make money and line their pockets. And I
Yeah.
think I'm sure that lawyers are not profiteering off this, or I hope they're not, but it does underscore just how ridiculously expensive it all is. And yeah, as people are quite right, there's other things that you can do. Lawfare is not the only tool in the box. It's my favourite because I think it's got the potential for the most impact. You look, Harry Miller's changed the law, actually changed the law for the better. But yeah, it's not without its disadvantages. I mean, obviously, and it is very stressful for the individuals. And again, that's the thing, it takes so much time. You've got to be in it for a couple of years, really.
Yeah. So obviously lawfare, using the law to force social change. Is it used in a way that basically, kind of similar to the question I asked earlier, to just clarify particular rights that we have, and actually clarify the law as a whole? Because as I say, if someone's using the Equality Act as an example, and you're using, say, the whole sex and gender, would something like lawfare be useful in that it will just give clarity on what that means under the guise of law, if you understand what I mean?
Well, I think there's a difference between lawfare to protect existing rights and lawfare to try and make social change. I think the second one is much, much more difficult and much, much more expensive. And I think people should be more wary of that. I think there's better ways to change the law than going to court. But how we've mostly been using lawfare is to protect rights that already exist and which have been unlawfully broken. And we've really got no other choice. I know at the Battle of Ideas, there were some people, saying, oh, why did Maya force her to go to court? What if she'd lost? I thought, you're just not getting it, because her fundamental legal right not to be discriminated against for believing that sex is real, something which 99.9% of everyone in this country believes in too. She shouldn't have had to lose a job about that. That was wrong. But she had to go to the Employment Appeal Tribunal to prove that. And she had to raise a lot of money via crowdfunding. But Maya Forstater and Harry Miller are really good examples of people using the law to protect their already existing rights. But Harry went one step further and actually got rid of the non-crime hate incident guidance. So he did actually use the law to affect social change. So good on him. He scored on both fronts, which is quite unusual, I think.
Yeah. Obviously, in America, you have these. I know we have one here, but I have that Supreme Court where if you can appeal, just judges can go in front of judges and try and get an appeal and try and get it overturned, etc. But what that's done in America, I think, just looking from the outside in, is it's made the law more political than it really should be. Is there a danger of that happening here? Or
well, American law is not political because there's an appeal system. I mean, any legal system has to have an appeal system because judges are only human and they get things wrong. America's got a political problem because I think a lot of the time they're electing judges, aren't they? The judges of the Supreme Court are chosen by the president, effectively. So America's kind of got it hard baked into its system that its judges are politicians as well as judges. And I think that's really bad. And that's why I'm so proud of our system, in that the judges try very hard to stay away from politics. I don't know if you remember all the fuss over Brexit and the judges who were saying, the Daily Mail was basically calling them the enemies of the people because they've made a decision that delayed Brexit. Oh no, this is outrageous. But they were just applying the law. And it was really wrong of the Mail to put their pictures on the front page and call them the enemies of the people. They're not our enemies. They're upholding our fundamental rights. And it's the separation of powers. You've got to keep politics away from judges and judges away from politics because they don't mix.
who hires, because I don't know this, who hires the judges for the High Court and Supreme Court in this country? How do
Oh, well, they're appointed of course, I mean, it's a good, I don't actually know the practicalities of who appoints them. All I know is you can't get rid of a High Court judge without an act of Parliament. So I'm assuming they must be appointed by the Lord Chancellor. It's really serious. You know, it's quite difficult to get rid of judges, and luckily we don't often have to, because they're usually quite sane and they go through a lot of rigorous training. But it's a really big deal if you say there's a High Court judge who's gone a bit mad. There was a judge recently, I think he resigned before he was pushed. He'd gone a bit funny because I think he lost all his luggage on holiday. And then every case he had, he started berating British Airways. And of course, that was not the way a judge should behave. And I think lots of people were really unhappy about that. But I think he eventually just resigned because he knew he'd gone too far. But to get rid of him would have been difficult. And I think that's right, because we don't want to go down the American road. I don't want judges worried about getting re-elected. They've got to apply the law. They've got to reach the decision that they think is right, not the decision that a politician or the Daily Mail wants them to reach.
Yeah, indeed. One thing I was going to speak to you about as well, and I've heard you speak about this before on GB News, is you're now starting to get lawyers who are refusing to prosecute or defend certain people based on like their political beliefs. So, for example, the story I heard you talk about was the lawyers who are refusing to prosecute the Just Stop Oil.
Yeah.
One, who are the prominent lawyers who behind that, and two, what does that mean for our democracy in terms of lawyers picking and choosing what they can defend or prosecute?
Well, I think it's really, really bad. And I think there were 12 or 15 KCs who signed that, including Jolyon Warne and including the ex-head of Alison Bailey's Chambers, you know, the same man who said Alison Bailey had breached the Equality Act and she was awful. I mean, it was laughable in a way because very few of the lawyers signing, if any, actually do prosecute people. So it was a bit of a gesture, but it's really dangerous because the whole point of being a lawyer is you don't take cases because you like the person or their politics are the same as yours. And you don't refuse people because you dislike them and they have different politics. You just have to take the case and do the best you can for your client. That's fundamental to the code of ethics of being a lawyer. So I think if you get these silks jumping up and down and saying, well, we're not going to prosecute or stop oil protesters because we think they're lovely, you're also allowing lawyers to be identified with their clients, which is dangerous, because I represent quite a few unpleasant people. I mean, criminal lawyers represent really unpleasant people. It's not fair to say because you choose to represent a rapist or a murderer that you're a bad person. Everybody has a right to a fair trial. If you were accused of murder, you wouldn't want a lawyer going, oh, I'm not going to touch you, you horrible man. You'd want someone who'd say, right, let's get on with it. What's the evidence? What can we do here? You know, it's not a lawyer's job to decide if somebody is guilty. It's their job to give them a fair trial. So I think that was really dangerous. Yeah, I remember speaking to Andrew Doyle about that. It's contrary to our code of conduct, and I said they should be disbarred, but I don't think anything's happened to them.
Yeah, I definitely think they should be disbarred. And similar to what you said with the judges about judges could be wrong, for the lawyers know they could easily be wrong. Like this, I don't know them. Like if you do that based on a particular person and then they turn out not to be as great as you think they are, well, you've just sacrificed your career for one person or even one ideology.
Yeah, you can't do anything on personalities in the law. You've got to apply the law, the evidence, the facts. You've got to be fair. You mustn't discriminate. And that's, you know, where we're going so horribly wrong is there's kind of this, we're being told it's all right to discriminate against certain groups of people because they're horrible. You know, women who believe that sex is matters, they're horrible TERFs. And that can't be right. We've got to allow for different people to have different views. Otherwise, what kind of society are we?
Yeah, I agree. In regards to the UK justice system, I know this is going to be a long list, but in the next 5-6 years, like, what would you like to see just the basics fundamentally change? I know we've talked a lot and it's a long list, but what would you like to see change in the criminal justice system?
God, where to begin? I think
exactly.
the problem is, I think it would need money, and we're not going to get money. I mean, just making the laws accessible. I don't know how we'd go about doing that. I mean, some people have been saying we need to codify the criminal law for a long time. I just think certain aspects of law are totally now inaccessible to anybody who doesn't have specialist training. And that's just putting us in a very difficult position when it's too expensive to pay for a lawyer and you can't get legal aid. So we've got to improve access to justice. And the best way will be to make the laws more accessible. But that is going to require a huge amount of effort, redrafting. And of course, there's no energy or will for that, is there? We don't have politicians who can think that far ahead. I mean, the Children Act was a massive piece of legislation because all the laws about children and protecting them were higgledy-piggledy and in different statutes, and no one understood what the hell was going on. So all the politicians got together and said, this is crazy, let's get an act and put it all together. And they did. And that was fantastic. But that was back in 1989. So I don't think we've had similar cross-party support for legal reform since. I'm struggling to think. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's so much I think we need to do, but that's the real worry at the moment, that the law is just becoming inaccessible. And that's a very dangerous place for a society to be in.
The first interview I did for this podcast, I was talking to someone who was a activist, and they were discussing biometrics and how basically the Data Protection Act they were using at the time hadn't caught up with biometrics, although it has now. I'm just wondering, similar to what you just said there, isn't a problem with a lot of the laws that they just haven't caught up with the present day? Yeah.
Well, the scientific technological advances have been so quick. Law is a very cumbersome process. You've got to draft a bill, you've got to get it approved, you've got to get it passed. I mean, we see that with all these laws about hate speech, for example. They're all really old. They all predate the rise of the internet, and they're not effective. I mean, Harry was told he was going to be arrested under the Communications Act, which makes it an offence to put something on the internet that causes anxiety to somebody else. Now, that's crazy. The law wasn't drafted with the internet in mind. You know, Twitter wasn't around then. It was much more looking at, you know, you sending something nasty to an individual, which would upset them. And I appreciate, you know, that I think that should be a criminal offence. If you target an individual for abuse, I think the police should come after you. But putting up a tweet on your timeline that somebody chooses to look at and then chooses to be offended by is different. So I think the police were using an outdated act. Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's just very difficult for the law to keep up with those sorts of changes. I mean, the changes in technology now with deep fakes, I mean, that all seems to have happened in the last 6 months, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it's really fast.
Yeah. Just quickly on a Communication Act before we go. So the way it works is it if you make someone anxious, is it, sorry, let me start again. If you make someone, an individual, anxious, is that how it works? Or is it more of a group thing?
Well, that's the problem. It says if you post something that causes needless anxiety, you can be guilty of an offence under the Communications Act. But because that act wasn't drafted with Twitter in mind, because Twitter's really the problem, isn't it? Because Twitter's the only place where you've basically got a notice board that anyone in the world can look at. I mean, it's different to Facebook and Instagram, isn't it? You don't have that level of immediacy. I mean, someone's really got to sort of seek you out on Instagram, I guess. Twitter is sort of more in your face. So for somebody to say, well, I'm really upset and offended by what I see on that social media site, well, it's just not the same, is it, as being an individual who's being targeted, say, in your own home, getting something through the post or email to you directly as an individual. That I could see would be quite frightening. If Harry was sending that swastika flag individually to people and they said, please stop, you're upsetting me, and he carried on, then I think the police should be involved. But he's not doing that. He put it on the Fair Cop Twitter timeline. Now, people ought to have a pretty clear idea what Fair Cop is all about. And if they find us offensive, don't look. I mean, isn't that the answer, rather than getting the police to try and arbitrate between people's anxieties?
Yeah, indeed. And I hope that these whole hate speech laws get sorted very, very
Yeah.
soon, because we don't fight too long. But we're nearly at the end of the interview. What are you up to like next month? Are you going back to Battle of Ideas? Like, what are your plans for the next
Yeah, I've got a ticket for the Battle of Ideas. I've got the next book launch coming out on the 22nd of July. So I'll update everyone about what's happening with Eventbrite, because obviously I don't think, sadly, I'm going to be able to get very far with it because they are a multinational corporation. But I know people have given me money, so I think I've got a duty to update them and tell them what I've done with it.
Yeah.
So keep your eyes peeled for that. and see what they do with my next book launch. See if they pull that as well. Try and get a bit of publicity and get a bit more conversation about it.
Oh, cool. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been very fascinating for sure. But Sarah Phillmore, thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. Have a lovely rest of the weekend.
You too.
Oh,
You too.
bye bye.
Bye bye.